We'll go ahead and jump right in. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Knight, the Executive Director for the California Community Action Partnership Association. Most of you know us as CalCAPA. We're delighted to be here to bring this training, this presentation today on what makes a community action strategic plan so unique. What's really interesting is this is probably the biggest question that we get here at CalCAPA. And so we're really delighted to be able to bring this today. We will be recording today's session so that other folks that couldn't join us today can take the information and process it at their own time. So thank you for all that you are here. I do want to recognize that both Katrina and Lawrence are with us from CalCAPA today. As you know, Katrina is our Deputy Director and oversees our impact. Lawrence is in charge of our training and technical assistance. And so he helps make sure all these things are put together and goes out and works individually with our agencies on this as well. As I mentioned in the opening, this is one of the biggest areas that we get a request for. So we're really excited to bring this information today and to have a conversation around what specifically makes a community action plan, or excuse me, the strategic plan, very community action specific, and also how those community action plans work together with that strategic plan. So as I mentioned, we are with CalCAPA, and CalCAPA is the California Community Action Partnership Association. So we represent 60 members across the state of California that represent all 58 counties throughout California. And what we're able to do is focus in on both communications, policy work, advocacy work, but as well as training and technical assistance in events like today. So that's where our focus is. So let's jump right in and start talking about why is the community action agency planning so unique in general. Well, there's three major areas just right off the bat that really kind of help organize and help us understand. If you worked in any nonprofit outside of community action, even if you worked in for-profit businesses, strategic planning is a big part of how we guide and how we move our organizations forward and how we understand if we're successful or not. But what really makes it specific about community action is our direction that we get through the systems that we have in place to kind of guide our work as we go forward. A couple of those big areas that we're going to hit on today to really analyze what makes us so unique. First of all is ROMA, which we know is results-oriented management accountability. So it's the cycle, it's the process in which we do our performance management. And strategic planning is a big part of our performance and our ability to manage that performance. And years ago, over 2 decades ago, we as an organization or as a entity, as community action, decided that, we're going to use the ROMA principles, and we'll touch on those. But also a big piece that really helps guide our work, and we'll focus a lot of our conversation today, is the organizational standards that were developed for community action agencies to help us guide our work and for us to better understand what makes us specific. Within those, there's some major points that I wanted to point out right at the very beginning, which is what's so unique about us is that we just don't look at strategic planning. We just don't look at outcomes, and we just don't look at needs from a very singular approach. We look at it from a tripartite approach, which is family, agency, and community. And we're going to dive into that, but how that's ingrained into our planning. How do we look at the community as a whole and be able to really identify if it's a family level need, if it's a family level outcome that we need to have, as well as being able to look at maybe internally as an agency. And as we know, a strategic plan is very much about what the agency can do. So we're going to talk about what the unique differences are on that and how that matters and where that was set forth to make us so unique. The other part is our CAs must complete a comprehensive community action plan every 2 years. So that is in our law, and we'll talk about how that lays out and how that coordinates with the strategic plan, which is very, very specific to CSBG eligible entities and all community action agencies. So let's jump right in and see where we're at. Well, the first thing that we mentioned was ROMA. So just a brief stop here to talk about what the results-oriented management accountability cycle looks like. Many of you have seen this. If you ever participated in any other training, you may have heard of ROMA reporting, or we've got to have ROMA training for our boards, or we got to have ROMA training for our staff. You may have heard that term a lot. But Roma really is that performance management cycle, that system in which we've put in place to be able to achieve the results that we want to be able to do. And Roma really guides each step of our way as we work our agency. But today we'll focus on a specific part of that, which is that planning piece. And that planning is being able to use all the information that we have to set forth a real, very direct guide to how we're going to do our work. And so Roma really helps set that up for us and makes us extremely unique in how we do that. Again, I'm going to mention a couple of different times how we operate versus where you may see other agencies that don't receive CSBG fundings and how they operate. And what's really specific about us is that this Roma principle is laid out in multiple different pieces as we go along and how that produces. But before we get into the planning phase of Roma, what we do have to do is take a step back and understand what is very unique about the assessment and the process in which we do that. And one of the things that's extremely important as we build our strategic plan and making sure that it meets the standards that we want to in community action is what we know as the CSNA. You may also have heard of it called the CNA, which stands for the Community Strengths and Needs Assessment or the Community Needs Assessment. And this is a principle that a lot of you have heard about, but it's extremely important that we identify that this is that first step in strategic planning and the uniqueness of how it helps develop our strategic plan. Now, the CSNA, the biggest part of it really is a tool for us, whether it's our board, whether it's our leadership or all staff throughout our agency, to really be able to use that tool and to use that process to create a higher level of understanding about our communities. And so a big part of that focus and how that happens is not just here locally. What we're seeing both from our funders from a national standpoint and also our state offices that govern and monitor our work in community action is a huge increased focus on the connection between our needs assessment and how we do our overall planning. So again, I want to say that again, you're seeing a huge focus, not just locally so that we're better outcome driven, but you're seeing that from a national funder perspective. You're seeing that from state offices where they're going out now saying, hey, how does our needs assessment, how does that process that we do to collect that information, how does that match? How does that really make sense with our planning? And that is very, very unique in our community action experience. Because a lot of times if you work in different outside of community action nonprofits, you may see that the strategic planning process is more about what the wants, what the people that are driving the board want to be able to do. And in our early directive, it says, part of us is to understand what the whole community wants to do, and that information has to be based on facts and based on data that is out there around the people that we serve and our customers. Strategic plans with clear goals and objectives and measurements are expected. And just ultimately what I said earlier, which is a good place to start to say, how do we make clear goals in our strategic plan make sense? A good place for us to start is really the community strengths and needs assessment. But one of the questions is, why do we do that? Why don't we just sit down and start planning and saying, these are the type of things that we want to do, that we want our organization to be, but why do we actually have that community strengths and needs assessment plan? Well, first of all, it's really simple. It's the law. The law is under the Community Service Block Grant Act. You can actually look it up. It says an assurance that the state will secure from each eligible entity, and that's what our community action agencies are in the legal terms, is a community service block grant eligible entity in the state, a community action plan that includes a community needs assessment for the community served, which may be coordinated with a community needs assessment conducted for other programs. What's key is ultimately when the law was written, it said part of what we do, part of our planning process, part of deciding who we're going to become and how we're going to become that, is that we will do a full community needs assessment. And so if we're deciding how we're going to spend our CSBG dollars, how we're going to do that portion of it, we have to do that needs assessment. And then throughout this, and you'll see what's very core to community action going forward, is the idea that we understand what the needs of our people are and very, very specific to those. Other places you started to see that. So obviously it was written in the original act. It was also moved forward in that. But as far back as 1970, the Office of Economic Opportunity had instructions for us. It said CAs must develop both a long-range strategy and specific short-range plans for using potential resources. In developing its strategy and plans, the CA shall take into account the areas of greatest community need. So that word greatest is really impactful for what we do, which can be very, very difficult in our work and what we're having to do. So This is extremely important when we start to say what makes us so unique about our strategic plan is that we have a very, very thorough process to do our community strengths and needs assessment so that we can identify what are the greatest needs. Now, I want to clarify later on, we will talk a little bit about what those type of needs could be. And we do understand as you're sitting down and starting the strategic planning process, you may say, well, our agency doesn't necessarily have all the resources to meet all those needs. Here in California, we recognize that our biggest need all too often is affordable housing. And your organization, when you're sitting down and getting ready to do your strategic planning, may say, we don't necessarily have the resources to be overly involved in that. Well, we understand that, and they understand that, but the process is that we have to establish what that need is and be able to figure out how that plan and what kind of resources we can find to try to meet that plan, to meet that objective, to meet that goal, to overall overcome that need. And so it's still a big part of our process. And one of the things to think of is not to just necessarily say, we want to develop a strategic plan that does the activities that we like to do, but also we have to make sure that we recognize what that greatest need is. So that started as far back as 50, am I doing my math right now? Yeah, 54 years ago. So that's always been a big part of us. As many of you know, this year is our 60th year. So for 54 of the 60 years, you've had that direction, that instruction from the Office of Economic Opportunity. Going forward, just to kind of see how that has shifted, where that information is, as you start to move forward in our needs assessment process, what other documents guide us? Well, ROMA was introduced in 2001, and there's a whole history, and that's another whole training session that we could have. But around that results-oriented management accountability, what was really, really key is even under those new guidelines from from HHS, which is involved now to HHS, is you'll see that the CAA and a board complete regular assessments of CAA's overall mission, desired impact, program structure. But ultimately, you'll see you're taking into account the needs of community residents. So if we go as far back as 2001, which if you recall, during that time in community action, we were developing a lot of new performance management framework in response to 1998, which was the Government Performance and Result Act. So because we're receiving federal dollars, and those federal dollars have to go, have to follow the guidelines of the Government Performance and Result Act, known as GPRA a lot, if you heard that term. This was our response to that. And our response said, this is the system that we'll put in place, right? Here's the actual information of exactly how we're going to do that. And you'll see that this is extremely important as you go forward, because as you're starting to think about how do we make sure that we're meeting the unique nature of a community action strategic plan, you want to understand, hey, we've got to make sure that that IM is met, IM 49 from 2001. Some other information that IM 49 says, based upon the periodic assessments, identify yearly results for individuals, communities, and agencies. So in that information memorandum, it continues to say that it's our job to understand what the outcomes are. It's our job to understand what the results are. It's our job to be able to understand how our agencies are able to achieve results. So all this is extremely important before we even start the actual strategic planning process. So a lot of times when people see the ROMA model and they say, okay, now we're in the planning phase, let's get right there. This is what we need to do. We need to think about that we actually have to take the 2 steps back to make sure that it's very, very specific to how we do our work in community action. And we jump back and we look at that and say, well, let's evaluate what our agency has been able to do so far. Let's assess what the current needs and resources are in our community that we can continue to use. Then we start planning. And this is very, very key into how we do this work, because a lot of folks want to jump right into saying, here are the services we should offer. Here are the goals that we should set. Here's all that we should have. And to be very unique and to meet these standards that we're going to talk about in a minute, we have to make sure that we're very adamantly completing the community strengths and needs assessment process. So just to kind of sum that up to understand what we're trying to hit is making sure that we understand that the original law was written, and it established the fact that we would identify what the greatest needs are and how we would involve folks in that process. And we're going to talk about how the organizational standards helps us meet those laws. Then from that, you hit information memorandum or IM 49, and it talks very specifically about each one of those issues and how that we're going to do that process, how we're going to completely plan correctly, as a comprehensive approach to that. So just want to make sure we take some time to touch on that. All right, so now we've established what the law is. So the next question is, So what? What does this mean? How do we go from there? You said this was going to very specifically tell me how we hit all these unique pieces into our strategic plan. Well, if we understand and we all agree that our needs assessment and its certain principles are very unique, and we'll get into some more of those specifics later, what's really unique about us is how we gather the information and who all is involved in our strategic planning processes. So the first piece is for us to understand is what makes us unique is that it is obviously very, very comprehensive in our development and how we develop this process. So first of all, it's extremely important that we understand not only it's about the needs, but it is a board directive, right? This is the way that we drive our strategic plans forward. It's driven by this board, and that board is very, very unique in its own way. What's really unique about a community action board is obviously the tripartite structure, which involves individuals of low income or individuals elected by low income individuals that have a voice at the table. One of the key pieces that makes us unique is the understanding of maximum feasible participation. And so that's why it's very, very key that the board development, that the strategic plan is derived from the board directive, that is driven by the board so that you continue to have that maximum feasible participation. Because a lot of times we get confused, and sometimes we'll say, well, maximum feasible participation is mostly about the idea that we put out surveys and then we have customer satisfaction and we get that information back. Now, while that's very, very important, the extremely important part here is to recognize that when we have members on our board that are selected by members of low income, it not only gives them a voice, but it gives them a seat at the table, which causes empowerment in the decision process. And that's extremely important that we understand that and how we meet that. And that's what makes us so unique in that side. The other piece that's very unique about our needs assessment process, our community action planning, and our strategic planning is that we use data and we use information from a lot of different opportunities. First of all, is being able to understand what our partners believe, right? So that's very unique in our strategic planning. When you look at other types of agencies, they may sit behind some closed doors and sit down and say, well, this is going to be our strategic initiative for our competition to better raise our stock, or to be able to better raise our portion of the community, or our portion of what we're doing for the community. Not the community action model. The community action model says we sit down with our partners and figure out where we fit in and what we need to be doing strategically as the joint body of everybody here in this community to better drive our mission forward. And so that's what's really, really important. But it's also making sure that we continue to include programmatic staff, right? And looking at what current programs we have and to better understand strategically what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. So that's why this is extremely important. And when we start thinking about the law, a lot of times we try to simplify it and say, well, the law says we have to do this, this is it. But it's bigger than that for us. For us, it's all about being comprehensive in making sure that we better understand our ability as a collective, comprehensive group of individuals to be able to achieve what's best for the community. And that's a really big point to make when we talk about what makes our strategic plan unique. Sure, a strategic plan is a business-driven document, and it's about making that community action agency stronger, having better outcomes, better able to deliver stuff. But the ultimate goal, right, is our mission. And what our mission typically has to deal with is how do we better make our communities able to overcome the negative effects of poverty, right? And so if that's it, it's all about the whole community and not just about our agency and how we're driving it forward. So that's a lot of information, but that's one of the principles to remember. And this is extremely important because if you're sitting down and you're saying, we're getting ready to start this process with our board, we're getting ready to start this with our leadership staff, you may have a lot of people with outside of experiences around strategic planning. You may be engaging with a consultant that has helped other types of agencies do strategic planning. And one of the things that's extremely important to remember is that, well, community action is very unique in the way that we do this planning, and it must involve all these other partners. It must involve multiple levels of staff so that we can have a better comprehensive strategic plan of how we fit into the overall poverty fighting network in our communities. So I wanted to lay all that out and to make sure that we understood that. But let's look at our next steps. We've talked about enrollment, we've talked about the needs assessment, we've talked about the process that makes us so unique. But what are some other items that are very specific into how we do our strategic planning? So for you that I do know, you probably know that I love dogs, and dogs are probably the biggest part of my life. So we're going to use a lot of dogs in our reference today to kind of drive forward. One of the questions we always get asked is, well, how do we make sure that we meet those community action standards? Well, one of the biggest standards through the whole list of org standards is Standard 6. And there's 5 principles under that. One of the reasons I use this picture is because while there's 5 principles and they're all under the standard and they all have to do with the strategic plan, they're all very unique. But it's important that you gather up all these 5 lovely dogs and put them in the same vehicle to make sure that you can drive this forward. And so we're going to break these down and look at them and go through each one. So just so you understand, again, there's 5 principles under Standard 6 that are able to drive us forward. And so let's break down what each one of those standards are. And what they mean and how they help us be unique in our strategic planning. Well, the first one's pretty straightforward, right? 6.1. Ultimately, is the strategic plan analyze and focus? So standard 6.1 says the organization has an agency-wide strategic plan in place that has been approved by the governing board within the past 5 years. Now, that seems very simple. It's just about guidance, about direction. So that's why I have this lab on here. It's just about being focused, being analyzed, being able to go straight forward, and to make sure that every 5 years we need to do this. Why is it every 5 years? Well, because in the last 2 to 3 decades, what we've seen is that poverty and the way that we work within poverty, and the way that our communities and the way that our organization stands within the community have changed, and they change fairly rapidly. We all really understand that now that we're sitting in 2024, which is less than 5 years from 2020. We can see what the impact was. We can see how things change. We can see how the outside influences, possibly with our strategic plan, have changed. But that is very important that we don't want to skip over that we have to make sure that it's in place every 5 years that we start that process. Why is this important to you? Well, ultimately, it's simple. You don't want to sit down and say, we're going to do a 10-year strategic plan. I can remember as far back as 2010 where everybody says, we're going to write Vision 2020. Unfortunately, nobody saw 2020 coming, even though how strong that Vision 2020 plan was. We have as a standard, put forth to said, that doesn't work for us. So you need to sit down and say, this is going to be at least, or at the max, I guess I should say, a 5-year plan. Some choose to do 3, some say that's too rapid. But you need to think about that, because one of the things that is very unique to us is doing that every 5 years means that we need to sit down and say, okay, when does this other plan end, right? If this other plan ends in 2025, well, we can't wait till 2025 to start the new plan. We would need to start that now. We need to start that whole process to make sure that when the other plan ends, we've got another one ready to begin and ready to start. So that's very, very key. Very analyzed, very focused, making sure that we're right there every 5 years that we stay within in that. All right, 6.2, it's about impact, right? And really creating an impact. The improved strategic plan addresses reduction of poverty, revitalization of low-income communities, and or empowerment of people with low incomes to become more self-sufficient. And this is very, very key. We are the Community Action Agency. We're a part of the original War on Poverty. And so when you look at the strategic plan, and this is what we see in a lot of them. A lot of times you'll get a strategic plan and it'll have a lot of agency level outcomes that folks want to have. It'll say things like, we ultimately want to raise our rate of pay, or we want to be able to restructure our organization and how that it handles customers. Or they'll talk about, we want to work on buildings and adding certain building space. And those are all fine strategic objectives, but you have to be able to relate that, right? How does it address poverty? How does it address empowering low-income individuals? And so you have to have that transition. One of the words we always use is that crosswalk to the objectives that you're trying to achieve, right? You have these activities, you have these objectives. How do they achieve these overall goals? And at some point within that strategic plan, we have to make sure that we're talking about those issues. So let me give you guys a couple examples of things that could be included in a strategic plan to help crosswalk that actual activities you want to do as an agency into overall outcomes and results. So a couple of different things in addressing poverty, empowering low-income communities. They can include different areas. improved quality of life for individuals. But you also want to be able to narrow that down. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But overall, improved quality of life for individuals. So this could be access to education or to healthcare. So let's go back and let's think about that. When we start thinking about a needs assessment, sometimes at the end of the day, it's really deciding that maybe we have an issue with our graduation rate. But it's being able to look at that and say, is that an access to adequate, strong education? We were just in a community, Lawrence and I, just here in the last couple of weeks. And one of the issues that came out is a lot of their low-income individuals do have a high school diploma, but they don't have anything else. And so what they want to be able to establish through their needs assessment process, is it really a lack of access to education? And if that's the case, then how do they create a better access to post-secondary, or secondary post-high school education? Right? How do they begin to create an access, and how do they write that out very specifically as a goal? Because they can see that impacting and empowering low-income people. They simply don't have access to that ongoing education in a very feasible way, right? That doesn't give them an access to be able to move up the economic mobility ladder. Other issues, economic empowerment. So empowering low-income individuals through skills training, job opportunities, entrepreneurship programs, right? This can lead to economic stability, independence, right? So making sure that individuals of all income levels, and our specific income level is low income levels, how do we make sure that we are identifying what specific skills that folks need to, and then talking about how that creates economic empowerment for the people that we serve. A big part of the discussion that makes us unique is it's not just about moving people up the economic ladder. It's moving them up the economic ladder, which also moves them up the justice ladder, like trying to create that ability for them to have an empowered voice, not simply make more money, but be able to make more money and have more influence to a certain point in their community so that they can help drive that community development. That's a big part of our strategic plan. Social cohesion. So building strong communities through empowerment initiatives, fostering a sense of belonging, support, and cooperation among residents. So in our strategic plans, one of the options may be about how do we empower the community to feel like they can come together. One of the strengths we see a lot of times in our low-income communities is the social connections that they kind of rely on, but being able to make sure that that social cohesion works among different communities throughout your overall population that you serve. So how are they able to be a representative voice? How are they able to be able to socialize just like everyone else as well? Reduced inequality. A lot of us know quite a bit about that, but addressing poverty and empowering low-income communities can help reduce disparities. But what we're talking about is an access to resources. We talk about an access to food, in access to housing, those type of things. So that reduced inequality in some of those strategic planning initiatives could really be about the idea that maybe there's some laws that we need to see change. Maybe there's some policies and there's some practices that we need to see changed, and that needs to be focused on within our strategic plan, because all these other services and all these other things that we do are not addressing that inequality. And then also sustainable development. We'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide and how that fits into 6.3. But the point about 6.2 is to make sure that we are able to communicate very efficiently and effectively how these overall ideas will help the whole community within poverty. So I want to make sure we touched on 6.2. All right, moving forward, 6.3. So 6.3 is a big one that we see missed quite a bit within the unique nature of a strategic plan for us. And it's pretty straightforward, though. It's about family, agency, and community. So the approved strategic plan contains family, agency, and or community goals. So let's talk a little bit about that and what that means when we talk about family. So we talk about family, agency, community from a lot of different levels. But let's think about what does that mean to be the difference if it's family, agency, or community level outcome. So let me give you guys an example. So at the family level, what you're really looking at is increased knowledge, skill, or ability, a change in attitude or behavior, a change in status. So an outcome for a family, maybe we have an individual that doesn't have a high school diploma, that individual gains a GED. That individual doesn't have a work skill, that individual attains that work skill, right? And they're able to really change their status. That's a direct family 101. We're very, very successful at this. A lot of agencies are extremely successful at being able to say, I have an individual family that comes in, they don't have an education, or an individual family that doesn't have a current home, and we want to be able to give them a home. And so we set those targets and say we want to be able to house 1,000 individuals, and that's our goal in our strategic plan. But what we lack sometimes is understanding how do we change that on a larger level, and how do we include that, or should we include that in our strategic plan? And what we're talking about that is at a community level, which is change in public policy, improve conditions, increase access to services and resources. One of the conversations we talk about quite a bit when we're talking about whether it's the community action plan or the strategic plan, when we start labeling out ideas that are very unique, is being able to say, well, we want to see an increased production or increased number. Let's say we want to increase our family food distribution by 10%. So one of the programs that we're going to lay out, you start to grab onto, is to say that we're going to bring in SNAP, or we're going to bring in CalFresh into our organization, and that is one of our strategic activities that meets our goal of increasing, the ability for families to access food by 10%. Well, if we only focus on SNAP, and we only focus on getting them a voucher for them to be able to pay for food, but we also don't look at those specific goals from a community standpoint to say, we also have to add the grocery store as well. We have to give them a place, and we have to analyze where that's at. We have to strategically understand that people maybe lack access to even use their CalFresh benefits. Then we're kind of missing what's different. And so that's what's extremely important. The community is not just about community assets or community services or increasing community resources, but it's looking at it strategic goals from a community-wide standpoint as well. It may ultimately say we want to decrease the lack of high school. We want to increase high school graduation rates by 10%. That's okay to put into a strategic plan and to talk about what part you're going to put into that. And again, if you remember back to the very beginning of this presentation, the strategic plan involves you, it involves all the community partners that you work with, it involves different departments you work with. That's what's really key to being able to have that unique nature of the community action strategic plan, is it says, we're going to put community level goals out there that are extremely important. And that's how we're going to hold ourselves to being accountable and to being able to measure those. A lot of times we see a lack of that in our strategic plans. People will say, we want to increase the amount of nutritional services that we offer. Okay, but what is that actual impact? What is that actual change to the community that you want to see? So when you're looking at that, it's being able to say, this is a community level outcome that we would like to have. 10% less hunger, 10%, again, less dropout rate. Those type of numbers, those type of very specific outcomes that make it very specific to who we are as community action is how we operate. The last one is agency level. And now we see a lot of agency strategic plan initiatives, like I said, especially when you get into human resources, or you talk about staff development, you're talking about professional development. You'll see a lot of targets into that. It says, maybe one of the goals is that we want to create a leadership style program within our agency, because we want to see, our goal is retention of, 50% more of our employees have a higher retention, 6 months longer, and those goals jump in there. We see a lot of those. But what happens a lot of times is that we see a lack of being able to establish certain outputs and outcomes along the way that have to do with the fact of lacking resources to provide a certain service or to make a community benefit. And let me explain what I mean with that. So a lot of times we'll see folks that go in and say, we do lack individuals that, the families we serve lack a high school diploma. So folks will write in the plan and they'll say, well, we want to increase the graduation rate by 10%. Good, we've got that community goal in there. We have a family level goal maybe that says we want to increase the number of individuals that we serve in GED programs by 200 people. Very specific to families, right? You have how many families you want to recruit. The issue is maybe you don't have a GED program at all. You have no partnership with that. You have no current resource. But you've got to stop to think about that and say, oh, well, we need to write a target and a goal about adding a new educational program, which could mean that some of the activities under that become very, very specific into being able to say, well, first of all, we've got to get somebody on staff that understands how to run a GED program, right? We've got to make sure that the funding's out there. We got to go out there and find these additional fundings. And so there'll be a lot of activities under that. So again, just in conclusion on that part, when we talk about agency goals, make sure that it's not just overall just about the agency itself as far as increasing staffing or increasing building space, but really looking at how, from an agency outcome standpoint, does it matter around resources and amount specific knowledge to create very specific type of outcomes. And what do I mean when I say specific type of outcomes? Let's hit on that for a minute. So under CSBG, one of the things that makes us extremely unique is we do have a framework for the different domains that we work within, that we believe as a national network and as a statewide network that are really important when you look at poverty and when you look at the ability to create economic mobility and empowerment for our families. And you see those listed here. So when we talk about employment, we talk about education, income management. This is just a selected list of possible areas that may be ideas to think about when you start saying, I want to really lay out very specific targets within our strategic plan that will create results for our communities and for our families. So a lot of these are things that you've seen quite a bit. They do match specifically with our CSBG annual report. It talks about being able to identify where our agencies spend money. That's very unique to us, okay, in these areas. That now, does it mean that you have to include every single one of these areas in your plan? Absolutely not, because again, if you're going through your needs assessment process, you may find out that in income management, that there's tons of organizations out there that do that type of work already, and that's already met. So that's not necessarily in your plan specifically. But these are very, very unique. One of the things I want to mention is how these are very specific. And again, that's because that's how they were selected along in the community action process. What we've established over the last 60 years is these are areas that are of grave concern and a great need for the families that we serve. So it's just an idea to be able to use as a checklist when you're looking at outcomes and you're looking to meet that standard 6.3 on both the family, agency, and community level. Next piece, one of the standards that comes out is making sure that you're looking at your customer satisfaction survey. We see this missed quite a bit in how people are developing their strategic plans and what data that they're using. So 6.4 says customer satisfaction data and customer input collected as a part of the community assessment is included in the strategic planning process. So when you look at and you sit down and say, do we have a system in place, right? Do we have something in place to be able to improve that, to be able to understand what our customer satisfaction level is? And then do we have strategic goals located within our strategic plan that say we're going to improve that if they need to, or how we're going to improve the overall process? So how do you do that? How do you make sure that we're meeting 6.4? Well, first of all, you want to sit down and assess where you're currently at. And I say here, assessing your last survey. All right, well, if there was no last survey, that would be the first place to start, is to make sure that we're putting one in. And overall, I just threw up some goals here for assessing customer service. So, and then when you're looking at, okay, what are some goals that we could list in our strategic plan that ultimately that we can try to create action items to meet those. So a couple of those are to improve the effectiveness programs and services we provide to our clients by applying customer feedback and corrective actions as needed, right? So that may be a simple objective that you're wanting to change, but your overall goal is to create. So if you don't have a customer satisfaction process, or you don't have a customer satisfaction survey, which in other standards is required of a community action agency, that would be the first target, is to make sure that you put one in place over the next 3 to 5 years. And so that should be a part of the strategic plan. The other piece is, if you do have one, is being able to analyze that and see what the processes are in place. If you need an example of a different policy on customer satisfaction, we have that. We're more than happy to share that with your organization so that you don't have to recreate the wheel there. Other things, to provide more comprehensive information on the impact we're having on customers. One of the other goals you may have is to assist in identification of customer service gaps that need to be addressed. So these are all different areas when you start talking about under a goal around service and around being efficient, effective, but actually measuring impact. These may fall under that goal of impact, is where you have a separate outcome just around customer satisfaction. That again is very unique to community action, but it's very important that we're constantly measuring the customer satisfaction, and then we're using that to better our programs, and we're using that to write the strategic plan to say, we want to be better. We want to see these results come out and to improve and be able to improve the functions in the way that we operate. One of the things I want to say on that is it's not just about increasing customer satisfaction, but when you have that process in place, then you're able to set other goals with that information, that data you receive, to say, maybe there's a goal on our implementation or our process. Example being, my last agency, one of the things that we saw is that when folks had to go to one certain center, they had to go to one certain location, our customer satisfaction is extremely low. Well, by able to analyze the data of those responses and being able to reach out to those folks and get more information allowed us to really understand it was just purely about the location of the building and not so much about our customer service and the way that we provided it. It was simply about the location. Well, that impacted our strategic plans. So we started talking about the ability to move that to a better location where folks didn't have to drive as far to get there. And improve their efficiency to be able to receive the services that they needed to without being less satisfied. So things like that are extremely important when we're meeting goals 6 or standard 6.4. All right, last part is the dog here that's looking really rough and just really trying to make sure that things are getting done, and that's called the governance standard, which is really straightforward, right? The governing board has received an update on progress meeting the goals of the strategic plan within the past 12 months. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, making sure that your strategic plan, right, has targets that you can review on a yearly basis, making sure that you receive an update. So this is a big part of understanding that both the board and the leadership need to have a system in place to constantly measure what the goals are of the strategic plan. So we've always heard these things about being measurable. It has to be measurable. It has to have a way to report out to be able to say, these are the goals, these are the options. So when you're writing those strategic plan goals and you're writing those outcomes underneath each goal, how are you going to be able to measure that? How are you going to, what tool are you going to use to validate that that's changed? So maybe you do have a goal of improved customer satisfaction. Well, then you need to be able to understand that we got to have a tool of here's how our customer, here's our customer satisfaction numbers. Here's our success rate prior to we set this. We operate, here's how we measure it at the end. That's what makes it very unique to Community Action, is being able to constantly measure that on a yearly basis and making sure that you're meeting that standard 6.5. All right, so in conclusion, again, standard 6 has those 5 principles. They're all very unique in their role and how they make us unique as a Community Action. But they all work together, and you got to put them all back in the car together and make sure that you follow all of them so that you can hit all the points that you need to. Now, here's the thing. That's a lot of principles. That's a lot of ideas around making us unique, but that's not the only thing that drives us in the organizational standards. We have another place where they can guide our way so that we're making sure that we follow those. Standard 4.2, the organization's community action plan is outcome-based, anti-poverty focused, and ties directly to the community assessment. So when you're looking at the community assessment, you look at the CAP plan, you look at strategic plan, it has to be outcome-based. So that's very key, because the strategic plan can't say, we just want to be better. It has to have very direct outcomes, right? It has to be really based on that. It really needs to focus on anti-poverty and those measures, and be able to very articulate or communicate, how each activity that you're going to do will relate to helping poverty in your community. The organization plan documents ROMA. We've talked about that. That is led in standard 4.3, as we've said. That started back as far as 1970, that we would have this system in place. And then 2001, we said this is our performance management. And now you see it when the org standards were developed as well, is that not only does it need to have ROMA, but it also needs to have the services of a ROMA certified trainer to overview to make sure that the process is seen there. Last one, 4.4, is the governing board receives an annual update on the success of specific strategies, including the community action plan. So again, these standards follow in other areas as well as in standard 6. And so they're there. So here's a lot of what makes it unique. How do we get to that point? Well, first of all, CalCAPA does have the tool to help. First of all, is we do have a strategic planning process manual. If you would like a copy of that manual, you can definitely send an email to Lawrence and he will get it shipped your way. The key things that it does, it first of all helps you decide on the scope and really how large you want to do it, how much you want to be able to tackle, what size of a strategic plan do you want to have, how long do you want it to go. But also one of the key things, it helps you organize and give you a very procedural outline. It gives you this very distinct procedure in which this is the first meeting, this is the second meeting, this is the third meeting. Other piece it does in there, it also gives you a kind of a checklist of what are all the tools that you should have. We talked about the community strengths and needs assessment. There's also the CSBG annual report. If you run Head Start, you have an informational systems report. Any other program that you run, you have data and having all that information. How do you have all that stuff together? How do you do all that analytical work prior to the strategic planning process so that you're efficient and effective when you build it? And then the last piece is assigning roles. That is in that toolkit. It allows you to say, we have a planning director, they're going to do this. Our CSBG director is going to do this. Our board secretary is going to do this. And really let you line that out so that everybody knows that they're expected to be a part of this development and a part of how it goes. So we do have that you can use it. One of the key things though, ultimately, when you start thinking about a strategic plan, it's just overall, what's that process? And you can see it here. It's just really, very making sure that you define exactly what you're trying to do so that everybody's clear. And then again, we talked a couple times about how do you plan, how do you get all that needs assessment information together and going forth. And then one of the things I want to hit on is making sure that we engage all keys, community action decision makers. I talked about this a little bit before, but ultimately you have an overall process that really makes sure that you ensure access to all data resources and that you involve everybody. What I can't say enough about what makes us unique in community action is ensuring that everybody's at the table and involved in the process in strategic planning, and not just being only the leader in the board. It needs to be all that information. A lot of that can be done through the needs assessment process so that you don't have so many people sitting around the table when you're starting to make those decisions. But at the end of the day, that you have each ability for people to give input each step of the way, and then use that input and then create another step. And then you go back, ask for more input, use that data, and then create a next step as well. So I'm going to jump over this slide here. Excuse me. All right. So last but not least, I'm going to wrap up. I want to give us just right at 10 minutes to ask any questions. If there's not, that's not it. But if there's any slides that I could go back to, I think we mainly hit on almost all the points of what makes it unique. Just in summary, again, it's about making sure that you recognize whether outcomes are all family, agency, or community, and that you're making sure that each one of them have a very direct crosswalk in line to the poverty issues in your area. So we've got a few minutes left to take questions. So do we have any questions? Any questions at all?
Hey, David, it looks like in the chat there were just some requests for some of the templates that we were mentioning, and we'll get those out.
Yeah, the survey template via email, that would be, that's a customer satisfaction policy, or are you talking about the strategic planning template? Okay.
Yeah, we had a request for the strategic planning template, and then another for the survey template.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Perfect. We can definitely do that. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We will work on getting this cut up and presented, and we'll send it out to everybody, and we'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of the template. Thank you guys for attending, and we appreciate it. Have a great day. Happy Tuesday.